All right, time for chapter 5. When we left off, Gregor had just jumped into the spot where Rip Red had been fighting in the battle. Gregor's feet automatically began to pivot. He just had time to turn once before the rats were within sword's reach. He gathered enough momentum to damage the two coming in on his left, one in the neck and one in the eyes, with the first cut. The person fighting to his right drew off another pair, but a trio of nasty-looking rats was still coming at him. He dug his sneakers into the grit and stood his ground. These three made Twirl Tongue's buddies seem like cream puffs. They were larger, for one thing, nearer to Rip Red's size. A combination of drool and blood dripped from their fangs. Their scarred faces indicated years of fighting, but it was the look in their eyes, the pure viciousness, that told Gregor that he was dealing with a whole new level of opponent. They knew how to fight as a team, too, coming at him with multiple attacks, so that it was nearly impossible to fend off both blows at once. He did, though. He did, because now the Rager effect was in full gear, splintering his vision, allowing him to only perceive the deadly teeth and claws, and, in rare moments when he was not simply defending himself, he let glimpses of their vulnerable eyes and necks where he could counterattack. The sort of white noise roar that sometimes accompanied his Rager state was there, but a voice was managing to cut through it. Although it was hoarse, almost beyond recognition, it could only belong to one creature. "Oh, look who's decided to show up, smelling like pudding and bubble bath. So glad you could make it. Had a nice little vacation, did you? While the rest of us were out here breathing sulfur and eating, not eating exactly. Howard had the idea of cutting off the leather pocket on your old backpack. That gave us something to chew on for a while. But I really can't call it filling. No, not satisfying in the way one might have hoped. Oh, and then there's been that little matter of freeing the nibblers. As you can see, the rats didn't especially like the idea." Gregor wanted to tell Rip Red to be quiet, tell him he was being distracting, but he didn't have a breath to spare, and forming words at the moment seemed very difficult. Like when he was trying to talk to someone in a dream, but no sound came out. A claw came within inches of his throat, and he took off the rat's foreleg at the joint. It fell back with a scream of pain. 2 to go. "You know, I've been getting to know that girlfriend of yours," Rip Red continued almost lazily, as if they had all the time in the world to chat. "She's not my girlfriend," Gregor wanted to yell at Rip Red, but the words wouldn't come. Besides, Rip Red already knew his feelings about Luxa. Denying it would only bring on another speech. "She's got grit, I'll give her that. You should have seen her taking those nibblers right out from under the Bane's nose. Would have made her grandmother proud," said Rip Red. The last thing Gregor needed right now was to think about Solivette, who was Lux's grandmother, and how she might be reacting to his running off. "But frankly, I'm a bit concerned about her," said Rip Red. Gregor caught one of the rats in the windpipe, and it retreated. But now Rip Red's words had his attention. Why was he concerned about Luxa? Was she sick? Injured? "What?" he managed to bark out. The last rat was a huge brute with teeth gnawed into razor-sharp points. "She needs some clean air. We didn't have masks until the army showed up, and by then she'd been breathing this stuff for days," said Rip Red. "I'm not wearing a mask, of course. Could hardly fight in that thing. But as a rodent, my lungs are tougher than hers." "She's sick?" Gregor got out. His opponent was relentless. Gregor had stabbed him twice already, but it only seemed to enrage him. "Sick? Well, yes, frankly, I'm not even sure she's still alive," said Rip Red. Gregor's hand faltered, and the rat he was fighting nailed his head with his tail. He fell to the right, pinning his sword against his arm. The rat immediately lunged for him. Gregor braced himself for the teeth when suddenly the rat was yanked up into the air, howling in a rage. Ares had sunk his claws into the thing's rump, and he carried it high into the cavern. The rat tried to twist around to attack the bat, but it was hopeless. When Ares released it, it screamed all the way to the ground, and then was still and silent. Rip Red stepped over Gregor, cuffing him upside the head with a paw as he went. "You're going to have a little more mental discipline than that to fight. Now get up." Gregor rubbed his head in confusion. Was this Rip Red's idea of on-the-job training? Had that thing about Luxa just been a test? Was she really okay? Gregor wanted to ask, but he was pretty sure Rip Red would knock him into next week if he did. "Get up," Rip Red repeated with even less patience. Gregor sprang to his feet. Rip Red had the center point of the arc once again. On his left was a woman Gregor recognized, Perdita. She had almost been killed the very first night Gregor had fallen into the Underland. He had tried to escape, ran into 2 rats on the beach, and was rescued by a party of humans and bats. Perdita had been badly injured that night, but she'd recovered from her injuries, and since then Gregor had trained with her. She fought with a sword and a dagger and could hit almost as many blood balls during drills as Gregor could, which made her one of the Regalion's top fighters. On Gregor's right was a man that Gregor had never seen before. He would have remembered him, too, because he must have been close to 7 feet tall. With both hands, he wielded a thick, broad sword that would easily have come up to Gregor's shoulder. He hollered a lot when he fought. "By me," Rip Red ordered, and flicked his tail to indicate where Gregor should fight next to Perdita. "She lives, Overlander," said Perdita as she stepped into place. She managed to shoot him an encouraging look between attacks. "Thanks," said Gregor. He was at first grateful and then embarrassed because he realized that Perdita now knew about him and Luxa. Maybe everybody knew, but Rip Red was right. He could not think about that now. He had to focus on the battle. Gregor wasn't the only one joining up with the forces at the tunnel mouth. Both the humans and the rats seemed to be directing all of their soldiers. There was no time to ask for explanation of the battle orders. It was all he could do to keep alive. But he knew Ares was an excellent fighting partner, but the bat was proving to be quite remarkable in his own right. Since so many of the humans were now fighting on the ground, their bats were executing a full-scale aerial attack on the rats. Mainly they would dive down, rip a clawful of flesh from the rat's back, and whip quickly back into the air to escape damage to their wings. But Ares was one of a handful of bats with the strength to lift a full-grown rat off the ground and drop it to its death. Ugh. Again and again, he picked up the deadliest fighters, saving many humans beside Gregor. And as the battle continued, Ares could hear desperate people began to call out, "Ares!" hoping for a last-minute rescue from a rat attack. Despite the grim circumstances, Gregor could not take help in satisfaction that his maligned bond was finally getting some appreciation. It was hard to tell how much time had passed, 30 minutes, maybe 45, when people began to call, "The nibblers are in! The nibblers are in!" He guessed that this meant that all of the nibblers had made it into the tunnel. He'd yet to get a good look at them, so he had no idea what condition they were in. Pretty bad, probably. A few minutes later, an order was given to retreat into the tunnel. Rip Red took a second to growl, "Not you, boy," at him, so Gregor just held his position. This was getting trickier by the moment, because now he was up to his knees in bloody ash, and keeping a foothold was harder than ever. Around him, humans and bats carrying wounded began to make for the tunnel. He heard repeated cries of, "No torches! No torches inside!" and could only wonder what that was about. Those carrying torches hurled them like javelins into the army of rats, causing some welcome disruption. Retreat seemed to be something the humans and bats could execute quickly, because in a matter of minutes, only 20 or so were left defending the tunnel mouth. Then they, too, under tremendous pressure of the rats, slowly began to fall back. Soon, even the front line, still composed of Perdita, Gregor, Rip Red, and the giant man Gregor didn't know, was forced to run into the tunnel. "Flyers, go!" Perdita called. Ares and the last 2 bats swept across the rat army, peppering them with torches, and then dove into the tunnel. Gregor had backed only a few steps into the tunnel when he knew he was going to run into trouble. "Why no torches?" he yelled, but no one had time to respond. Maybe there was some sort of plant in the tunnel that was flammable, some weird moss or something. The light from the cavern was growing faint. That meant he was going to have to rely entirely on the flashlight taped to his arm to see. He clicked the switch to turn it on high beam and was reassured by the amount of visibility it restored. But what about the others? Rip Red didn't need light to fight. He could see by echolocation if need be, as could oncoming rats. Perdita could probably get on by what his flashlight was putting out, but that big guy with the broad sword on the other side of Rip Red was going to have problems. "Retreat, it's too dark for you," Rip Red said to the man, whose only response was a string of curses. Gregor yanked on a spare flashlight and turned it on. "Hey, you at the end," he yelled. No response. "York," Perdita prompted him. "Hey, York," said Gregor. The man looked over and Gregor tossed him the flashlight. "In your teeth," he instructed. There was no time to tape it to York's arm or even explain what the flashlight was, but York seemed to get the idea. He yanked off his mask, crammed the end of the handle between his teeth, and kept hacking away at the rats. Somewhere behind him, Gregor supposed, were backup soldiers, but he never saw them. As the rats drove them deeper into the tunnel, all of the light disappeared except for the beams from the flashlights. And between handling his own rats and trying to keep Perdita from falling into darkness, there was no time to turn his head. He was still managing, but in this gloom, could it be that some of his confidence was slipping away? A rat's tail came frightening close to taking out his flashlight, cracking the glass. A claw caught the duct tape, almost ripping it free, and Gregor realized that they were targeting his light. They must know, after his humiliating encounter with Twirl Tongue and her pals, that he was worthless without it. He ripped off his mask, pulled the flashlight free, and stuck it between his teeth as he had instructed York to do, just barely blocking a tail that came straight for his mouth. The bulb was beginning to dim. He could feel the power draining out of him, and the seeds of fear began to grow. What should he do? Tell Rip Red? Keep fighting? Cut and run? Because frankly, if his rager abilities left him, he was just another 12-year-old kid who had had a few sword lessons, and as he was realizing, a really tired one at that. A rat claw got through his defenses and opened up a cut on his calf. The tip of a tail made contact with his flashlight and knocked the beam sideways. As Gregor straightened it out, another claw tore through the laces on one of his shoes. "I can't hold." Gregor wanted to scream, but the flashlight made it impossible to talk anyway. But he had to at least let someone know that he was fading, and that they couldn't count on him. "Hey!" Gregor yelped as his feet flew out from under him, and he landed on his back in a pool of thick, slippery liquid that came sputtering up. "Run! All of you!" snapped Rip Red, and began a spin attack. What was going on? Gregor scrambled to his feet and saw, by the light of York's flashlight, that his own having dropped somewhere into the pool when he cried out, that York and Perdita had not hesitated to follow Rip Red's instructions. So Gregor ran after them as well. That is, he tried to run, but he was doing more waddling than anything else. The floor sloped down and the liquid rose up to his chest. It was all he could do to sort of blob forward. York's flashlight showed that they were in a shiny black pool that filled the floor of the tunnel. Oil, he thought. What else could it be? Gregor held his sword high over his head as he went along, hoping the stuff wouldn't get any deeper. Moving forward, until there it was, the light at the end of the tunnel. Literally. The pool became shallower, and now Gregor could run, but carefully, because the stuff was so slick. He went toward the light breaking out of the tunnel, but still up to his knees in oil. Before him lay a huge cavern, at least a quarter-mile long, that was much less dusty than one that they had battled in. At the far end were lit torches, but they were placed very high on the walls. Huddled far below the ground lay hundreds upon hundreds of mice. Gregor didn't know exactly what was happening, but he got a grip on the blade of his sword and began to sprint. This was one thing he could do, whether he was raging or not. He could hear his track coach's voice coming from what seemed like another lifetime, calling pointers to him. The oil disappeared, his sneakers hit cinders, and he accelerated. Humans on bats were flying by, picking up mouse stragglers and wounded. Ares flew in for him, but Gregor waved him toward the mice, since some of them were unable to even get to their feet. Suddenly the cinders vanished, and he was wading again, this time through a shallow river with a current. He plucked a struggling mouse pup from the water and hoisted it onto his shoulder. Fortunately, it was able to cling there on its own, because his arms were soon full of a second pup. As he came to the bank on the far side, hands reached for the pups and pulled him up onto a beach. Gregor collapsed, gasping for breath. He looked back across the cavern. The last few mice were being lifted from the ground and flown here. 3 humans on bats were jetting toward the tunnel with the black pool. They each carried a bow in one hand and a flaming arrow in the other. "Shall I give the signal, Your Highness?" shouted a voice. Not yet. Gregor could barely make out the hoarse voice. He turned, and there was Luxa, just a few yards behind him, eyes fixed on the tunnel. She was drenched in oil, and so weak she had to support herself on a rock. "Now, Your Highness?" The voice was tense with urgency. "Just give him a few more minutes," said Luxa. "There!" Gregor looked back, straining to see the tunnel opening. A large, glistening, barreled out of the mouth and made for them. Ripred. Any second now, the army of rats would be after him. Behind him, Gregor could hear Luxa whispering, "Wait for them, wait for them." Then, as the first rat heads appeared, he heard her say quietly, "Now." The signal must have been given because 3 archers shot their flaming arrows into the pool of oil spilling out of the cave. As the first made contact, a ball of flame burst toward the ceiling, igniting the rat army. Gregor knew it must have blasted back into the tunnel across the pool, incinerating everyone in its path. For a moment he couldn't help thinking of what that must have meant to the rats burned alive, the black smoke suffocating those who had been far enough up the tunnel to escape the fire, the horror of it all. Then another danger arose. So much oil had been dragged across the cavern that the fire spread toward them as well. Although it was not as fierce, it would be deadly if it caught on any of their oil-soaked bodies. Gregor sprang to his feet. "Ripred! Where's Ripred?" he shouted, only to see the big rat splash into the river before him. He looked up to where Ares was circling overhead. Ripred slowly dragged himself onto the beach and surveyed the scene. There was no trace of the rat army. Only a roaring fire before the tunnel. The flames had stopped at the far side of the river, cut off by the water. They were safe. "Now, whose idea was this?" he croaked out. "Queen Luxa's," said a nearby Underlander. Ripred turned his head, spotted Luxa leaning against the rock, and glared at her for a moment, and then he gave her a nod of approval. "Good plan." Luxa opened her mouth to answer, but instead began to cough into her hand. It was a horrible, rasping cough that shook her entire body. When she removed her hand from her mouth, it was covered in red. She stared at the blood for a moment, as if faintly surprised, and then collapsed to the ground. Tune in later for Chapter 6.